Hello, environmental science class. This is the Unit 3 content video. As always, there's a link to the vocab at the bottom corner of the slides. Those are also available on Quizlet. Unit 3 is all about biomes. So we just got done talking about the whole human impact on the environment, and I know we only scraped the surface of that. There's a lot we could go further in depth. We just don't have a whole lot of time, and there's other stuff we got to talk about this year. So the first lesson is going to be talking about how to describe an ecosystem or a biome. A lot of these are the same, so we're going to cover them at the same time. There's a little bit of a difference in how we define ecosystem versus biome, but the factors that we use to describe them are very similar. All right, so an ecosystem. First off, let's make sure we know what it is, right? So an ecosystem is all the organisms that live in an area together plus the environment that they live in, right? So everything that lives in an area plus the physical environment. And we've got two factors to talk about, abiotic and biotic factors. As you probably learned last year in biology, bio means life. So abiotic means not living. The A there means not in this case. So non-living factors that we might consider when talking about an ecosystem or a biome is the air, the water, the rocks that are present or sand, as well as the light that the environment receives and the temperature. Right? Something else we might include here, as opposed to rocks and sand, is water, because ecosystems can also be freshwater or saltwater. A lot of times saltwater biomes are called marine biomes, while freshwater biomes are called freshwater, to differentiate between the two. And a way that we classify based on these abiotic factors, there have been quite a few. One of them is the Holdridge Life Zone Classification Scheme, which is this kind of complicated graph here. I know that usually we don't see graphs on triangles, but this is one of them. So you can see my cursor moving around here. On this axis is potential evapotranspiration. So that's the amount of water that leaves the environment and the plants. Right? So water being evaporated from the plants or from the environment itself. So this is the amount of water leaving the area. Annual precipitation, that's the water, entering the area through rain or snow, ice, hail, all those kinds of precipitation. And then we can look at humidity down at the bottom of our screen. This is what we would consider an x-axis in math, right? So humidity provinces, we've got super arid over here all the way to super humid. So arid means dry, humid means wet in this case. All right, with the semi and per prefixes being added on there. All right, so very humid, less humid. Well, we're just going to consider humid, more dry than humid, more wet than dry, right? More humid than arid, and then arid, per arid, and super arid, right? We can also look at the latitudinal regions or the altitudinal belts. So latitudinal regions is on the globe, right? Those are those horizontal lines on the globe. So we've got polar being away from the actual equator, right at the top and the bottom, the north and the south parts. Subpolar and boreal being closer to the center, but still way up top and way towards the bottom. And then we're going to move all the way to tropical, which is near the equator, and subtropical, which is right next to the equator. The altitudinal belts is the elevation, all right? So alvar, alpine, subalpine, montane, lower montane, and pre-montane are the altitudes, and from those we have average temperatures. So Holdridge used critical temperature lines to say, okay, here's the average temperature for the time. right? So you would use all of this data to find a specific biome, right? Since 1964, we have kind of simplified this. The one that I like to use is made by Robert Whitaker. It looks like this. It's just much easier to read, and it covers a lot of the same materials because there are a lot of correlations between this data, all of this data, and these two measurements. Annual precipitation, so how much rainfall or snowfall there is. This graph happens to measure this in centimeters. And the average annual temperature, which is measured in degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit, right? Not Fahrenheit. This is Celsius. We're scientists. We're going to use Celsius or Kelvin if we can. And it arranges these biome types based on these two measurements. So just like in any graph, we can use the x-axis and the y-axis to read this graph. So if you have an annual temperature of 10 degrees Celsius and you have a precipitation of, like, say, 150, you'd go to the center here, right? Because that's between 100 and 200. And you would read, oh, this is a temperate seasonal forest. I don't need you guys to memorize this list right now. We got to make sure we can read one of these graphs. All right? We can deal with the types later. If you were at, say, 25 degrees Celsius, which is much hotter, and you had a lot of rain, say 300 centimeters of rain per year, you'd be in a tropical rainforest. So the wetter regions are higher on the graph. The drier regions are on the lower part of the graph. Temperature is left to right. Pretty easy to read. This one is still being used. There is a much more complicated way to look at these biomes now, but this is what we're going to go with today because I want it to be easier on you. Also notice that all of these are land biomes. There are no water biomes present on this graph, which is a big drawback because 75% of the Earth is water. The other thing we're going to look at for classifying an ecosystem or a biome are biotic factors. So biotic factors, I already said bio means life, right? So this is everything currently living or that was once living. That's an important distinction. Currently living or once living. All right, so we've got plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, protists, all the good stuff. But we're also going to consider dirt and waste products here. Dirt is broken down from things that were once living. Right? It is what's called the final step in succession of reclaiming stuff that's biomatter, plant and animal matter that's been broken down through the acts of fungi, bacteria, and protists into something that can be used to grow new materials. So dirt is important, and waste products. So animal poop, manure, that kind of stuff. Also, dead animals. That counts. So this would also consider things like coal, petroleum, oil, natural gas. Right? We can also, I'm going to move my face, don't worry. So we can also do what's called a connections web for an environment and look at how the animals and their environment interact. This is just a biotic connections web, so it with animals and plants and some protists down here at the bottom. All right, so still on my screen, you can see my cursor moving around. Okay, so an important thing to remember with these kind of connections is that there's always something that kind of gets left off. We can draw it on here. I didn't. This is one I quickly drew up. And that's the sun, right? Remember that we talked about in biology how all energy comes from the sun on Earth at some point in time. So we've got phytoplankton down here at the bottom. I'm going to move my cursor so that menu goes away. Phytoplankton are autotrophs. So they make their own energy from solar energy. So they're going to do photosynthesis. Right? That energy gets transferred to heterotrophs when they're eaten. So that phytoplankton gets eaten by zooplankton. small piscivorous fish, which means they're small fish that eat other fish, or clams and oysters. All right, so these arrows are showing consumption. So one thing eating another thing, and they always go from prey to predator. All right, or if you have an autotroph going to a heterotroph. All right, seaweed is another of our autotrophs. It does photosynthesis. It's eaten by herbivorous ducks. So that means ducks that eat grasses, plants. They're herbivores. All right, grasses are another autotroph, also eaten by these herbivorous ducks and by geese and by tundra swan. Right? A lot of these are eaten by something else. Some of them are not. So, like tundra swan and geese don't have any predators on this map. That's not saying that they don't have any. I'm just not listing them here. Right? Others, like the clams and oysters and the small piscivorous fish are eaten by other things. So the small piscivorous fish are eaten by gulls, herons, or just larger fish that also eat other fish. Sea ducks and tundra swans also eat the clams and oysters. Sea ducks are eaten by bald eagles. Large piscivorous fish are eaten by bald eagles or osprey, but herons and gulls also don't have any predators on this content map. So we've got a bunch of biotic things, right? Animals working together, or, not because they're eating each other, in an environment. All right, I'm going to move my head around a little here because I don't like it being in the top right. There we go. All right, so a way to think about this organization is we can continue to go from smallest to biggest, right? So we've got a single organism. That's one thing, right? One plant, one animal, one fungi, one living thing. A bunch of those together make a population. Populations have the same species in them, right? Multiple populations living in the same area that interact, like we just saw in that connections web, makes a community, right? The community plus the space that they're living in makes an ecosystem, all right? Multiple ecosystems together will make up a biome. And if you take all the biomes on the planet, you get what we call the biosphere, right? Which is much bigger, obviously. So I decided to break that up into some nice words. These definitions are in order of magnitude, so that means they get bigger the lower we go on the screen. All right, so these are just our definitions. They're also on Quizlet. So remember, we said organism, an individual living thing. You need to know what a species is so that we can talk about populations. You should remember what species are from biology. They're a group of organisms that are closely related. They can mate and produce fertile offspring. Fertile offspring being an organism that can mate with a similar species organism and have fertile offspring of itself. All right, populations, all members of the same species that live in the same place at the same time. So I live in Columbus, Ohio. However, I'm not part of the same population of someone who lived in Columbus, Ohio in 1943. All right, they are time dependent. The community is all the populations that live in the same place. Again, we're talking about at the same time, but it kind of gets dropped off here because we can also consider dead things as part of the community. Ecosystems include that physical environment, right? So now we can count those dead things, whereas before they weren't counted because they weren't alive. Biomes, we're going to say that those are large regions characterized by a specific type of climate and certain types of plant and animal communities. So we're looking at the climate and types of plant and animal communities, very similar to what we were talking about for ecosystems. That's why I was saying we can go over those rules at the same time for both. All right, I know this picture isn't the sharpest or best. Again, we don't really need to remember all of the individual types of biomes. I'm more concerned with you being able to get the general concepts here, right? So this chart or graph, this graphical representation, one of those models we talked about at the beginning of the year, works on 3 different axes again, right? This is a triangle, so 3 sides. On that side of the screen, right? The side that I'm pointing to, I don't know if it's your left or right, but it is this way, right? That one is increasing latitude. So latitude is from the poles to the equator, right? This one calls it Arctic versus tropics. That side of the screen is decreasing temperature. So hot is at the bottom and cold is at the top. At the bottom is precipitation. So we've got wet, so lots of precipitation on that side, right? Way down in that corner, and dry way down in this corner, right? I know my left and rights are screwed up because I flipped the camera so that it looks better instead of just seeing what the webcam makes it. So tundra up here at the top is very cold. It has a medium amount of precipitation between mostly snowfall because it's so cold, and it's near the poles. Deserts are over here on the dry side, and they change based on their latitude and temperature. All right, so the hotter it gets, it becomes a temperate desert versus a dry tropical desert. There's also a moist tropical desert, which just has more rainfall than a dry tropical desert. Right? Again, I'm more concerned with you being able to read this type of graph than memorizing every individual thing on it. Okay? So when we are talking about describing an ecosystem or a biome, we need to make sure we're going over the abiotic factors and the biotic factors, right? So we've got temperature and precipitation are our main factors for abiotic. And for biotic factors, we're looking at which plant and animal communities inhabit it. All right, remember that is one of our vocab words now, community. Right. If you have any questions, make sure that you send me an email and reach out. Remember, you should be doing your work as it's assigned so that you don't fall behind and start drowning in late work and missing work. We want to finish this quarter strong to make up for last quarter, maybe. We'll see how that turned out. If you have any questions, reach out. Have a good day.